Hello. I'm happy to speak with you today as part of the We Are Together series of discussions with embassies in Russia. We congratulate the Library of Foreign Literature on the 120th anniversary of the birth of the founder of the library, Margarita Ivanova Rudamina, who helped foster the development of international cultural dialogue in Russia. As we celebrate this week the 244th anniversary of American independence in July 4th, I've been thinking a lot about my country and its history, its founding, and also its future. Of course, we've all seen the images over the last 4 to 6 weeks of unrest and protests in the United States in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota. In the aftermath of his killing, my fellow Americans have exercised their right to free speech and to peaceably assemble, protesting the horrific death of Mr. Floyd and demanding equality and fair treatment under the law. All of us at the U.S. Embassy have been deeply affected by this tragedy and moved by the many peaceful protests that followed. And we continue our wider discussion about human rights and equality in the workplace and in the greater society. But it's also given me an opportunity to think about the history and the founding of our country and the system that our founders established that has evolved over time, been amended over time, over the centuries, that allows American values to be applied and for Americans to grow and improve themselves both as a people and as the government we have. And these values that are so important to us are enshrined in our founding documents. And it's in this context that I wanted to share with you some of my thoughts about the founding of the United States and the rights inherent for each human being according to our Constitution. And it's particularly appropriate to do so in this week as we lead up to our Independence Day celebrations on July 4th. So people often refer to the United States as a new nation, and relative to many parts of the world, certainly our culture and society are quite brand new, particularly as compared, for example, to an ancient culture like Russia, dating back over 1,000 years to Kiev Rus, and this long history of great literature, music, etc. Yet there's one aspect in which the United States is an old country, and that is it's one of the longest standing democracies in the world. And our Constitution, our founding document, adopted approximately 230 years ago, is the oldest single national governing document. And I'd like to share some of the history of the establishment of our government to put in context the rights that we cherish as Americans and how those rights are being exercised by my fellow Americans today. This history hasn't been pretty, linear, or nonviolent, but our system of government has been stable for well over 2 centuries and has defined our character as Americans. The American colonists, our forebears, began fighting for their rights as subjects of the British Crown in April 1775. Yet after a year of fighting, a movement for full independence from Britain had grown. Delegates of the impromptu government, the Continental Congress, drafted a formal statement to sever ties, which was called the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence broke political ties between the American colonies and the Crown in London, and the Founding Fathers needed a new system of government to substitute for government by royal authority and the Parliament in London. The Declaration of Independence declared our political status as a new nation, or a collection of colonies as a new nation, but it didn't establish a system of government for the United States. And our founders needed to fix that omission. The initial document that they established to govern the United States, the so-called Articles of Confederation, didn't create a strong, cohesive national government, federal government that Americans desired and needed. And our founding fathers went back to the drawing board just a few years later in the late 1780s. And their goal was to create a more perfect union, a more perfect government to govern this new country. So they sought to revise and improve the system of government that had been established by the Articles of Confederation. And in a constitutional convention starting in 1787, the members agreed upon and signed a new system of government for the United States, which we call our Constitution, the Constitution of the United States. This Constitution established a federal republic with 3 separate branches of government: a legislative branch, our Congress, which has 2 houses, a House of Representatives with 435 members, and a Senate with 100 members. And the Congress, the legislative branch, makes laws, statutes that govern the United States. The second branch of government is the executive branch, headed, of course, by the President, who's the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, and the chief executive responsible for executing the laws passed by Congress. And finally, there's the third branch of government, the federal judiciary, which is headed by the Supreme Court of the United States and the Chief Justice of the United States. And then there are lower federal courts established throughout the country, actually established by Congress under the authority of the Constitution throughout the United States, which applies the laws that are passed by Congress and implemented by the President. Our federal republic also divides its powers between the states and the federal government. So our Constitution established that federal government, which I've just described, but each of the states in the United States, and there are now 50, has its own system of government, often mirroring the federal system, but at the state level, with independent state authorities that extend back to the colonial era when those states, those colonies, received the common law from the British Crown and established a basic system, legal system, which has grown into state governments across the United States. On signing the Constitution, it was a momentous moment because there were a lot of debates over the terms of the document, a lot of compromises that needed to be made, and one of the most famous founders, Benjamin Franklin, declared to our first president, George Washington, and I'm quoting here, "I confess that I do not entirely approve of this Constitution at present," and then he added, "It therefore astonishes me, sir, to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does," unquote. And what he's signaling is that there were a number of compromises that were made to establish this system of government, and a system of government in our Constitution that was intended to endure for decades, indeed centuries, and that's actually how it has played out. Our Constitution has endured for over 230 years. And the Constitution was specifically adopted with an amendment process in mind so that the Constitution could be improved over time as our society changed and as our values as Americans changed. I think Franklin sums up the philosophy behind the Founding Fathers' efforts, and his sentiments remain with us today. Americans have a constant, dedicated commitment to moving forward, to trying to perfect their union, which is governed, our union, which is governed by this Constitution. And at its base, it acknowledges a premise that no system of government is perfect. No system in history has been perfect. Our system of government in the United States is not, and it's been improved and amended many times over more than 2 centuries. And that amendment process has often been led by protests, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent. And there were protests to, for example, to expand the right to vote, the suffrage movement, which expanded the right to vote to half the population of our country, women, which wasn't contemplated when our Constitution was adopted in the 1780s. Similarly, racial injustice, slavery, was abolished by amendments to our Constitution. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, adopted in 1865, abolished slavery, but only after there had been a violent, destructive civil war and mass unrest across the country extending back decades as the controversy of ending slavery finally came to a head. So the history of the United States is a history of protest, of always seeking to improve our system of government and our society. And that extends to the present day. I'm thinking back to the civil rights movement of the 1960s with the famous March on Washington in 1963 with Dr. Martin Luther King uttering his famous I Have a Dream speech on the Mall in Washington. There was a March on Washington for LGBT rights in 1993 to the Million Man March for racial justice in 1995. It's in our nature as Americans to evaluate, question, express ourselves, and it's in our nation to constantly seek to improve our democracy. And it's specifically contemplated by the Constitution itself, adopted by our framers. As I mentioned before, the document itself, the preamble to our Constitution, it says that the Constitution is adopted, quote, to form a more perfect union, unquote. In other words, the Constitution was adopted by our founders with the express understanding that they were creating a more perfect union, but that with an amendment process in place, that union could be improved over time. And it was in that sense that the Constitution is a document that's been able to survive over these 230 years and continue to govern our country, because it's allowed future generations to improve it. In fact, at the very start of our republic, the Constitution was improved. After the Constitution was voted on, it had to be ratified by the 13 states that constituted the Union. And one of the conditions of ratification was the adoption of a Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which we refer to as the Bill of Rights. From the unique experience of the American Revolution and breaking away from a colonial power, the American people wanted guarantees that the new government would not suppress their newly won freedoms, including freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion. And the nation founders believed that constraining the government's power and protecting their liberty was their most important task. And so the absence of a statement of rights for individuals against a powerful government was an obstacle to the Constitution's full acceptance by the states. And one of the most famous founders of our country, Thomas Jefferson, argued, and I quote, "A Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth, general or particular, and what no just government should refuse." Delegates from the states debated for 4 years before adopting a Bill of Rights that guarantees and protects individual rights and liberties in the United States. And the Bill of Rights itself has become a defining characteristic of American democracy today. It protects what's referred to in the preceding document, the Declaration of Independence, as, quote, unalienable rights, unquote, or natural rights. And these are rights that all human beings naturally possess, whether they're in the United States, in Russia, or anywhere else in the world. And these natural rights include freedom of religion, the right to exercise one's own religion or no religion, free from government influence. Freedom of speech, including freedom of the press, to petition the government for redress of grievances and to peaceably assemble. Protection of every unpopular expression from government suppression or censorship. Privacy, the right to be free from unwarranted and unwanted government intrusion into one's personal and private affairs, papers and possessions. And finally, due process of law, the right to be treated fairly by the government whenever the loss of liberty or property is at stake. And ultimately, the basic premise of our Constitution and the Bill of Rights is equality before the law, the right to be treated equally before the law regardless of social status. Our American government and system of rights didn't develop automatically, but through a messy process, as I've said, that's included war, intense debates, and compromises. Our system allows us to have a national conversation and then find a solution to our problems. Even today, Americans still work to develop a more perfect union. We seek to improve ourselves and the great nation we call home. Voting rights, for example, have expanded, as I said, to allow women the right to vote, exactly 100 years ago this year. And of course, extending the franchise to the newly freed slaves after the Civil War, male slaves who became citizens with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, and then ultimately to as I said at the outset, half the population had been excluded from the franchise at our founding. The nature of the American spirit that Benjamin Franklin articulated remains just as poignant today as it was then. American democracy is a process where we come together to improve our government and our country. We continue to create a more perfect union that allows everyone, regardless of race, gender, or sexual orientation, the inalienable rights of all people, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is our beginning, and this is our defining characteristic as Americans. It's something that every school child learns about starting at the very beginning of their education. And it's something that's treasured dearly by all Americans, even as we disagree sometimes passionately and unfortunately, on rare occasions violently. We all agree on the great system of government that was adopted over 230 years ago and that has allowed us to continue to try to improve our system of government and our country. And it's that spirit that motivates all Americans to make our country an even greater place to call home. So thank you for allowing me to share these observations with you. As I say, this week is the anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence 244 years ago. We celebrate that on July 4th, and I hope my observations on the historic moment that occurred those many years ago puts it in some context why it's so significant to us as Americans. Thank you.